Good with that, Steve? Am I on track with that, Shauna?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't, the zone does not give you permission to just say, well, I'm gonna build this. Not without going through all the hoops of meeting that concept plan.
Right.
And then it comes here for preliminary approval, okay? And then there's a final plan. Okay, and if it all flies, then it goes to our elected officials, and they would say yes or no. So all we're doing is approving the zoning change. It might be in an R1 zone where this PUD being proposed, okay? Maybe it's in an R2, maybe it's in a C3. We don't know. All we're doing is by creating this PUD zone is saying we could do this in a certain place, provided these things are met. Okay? Doesn't mean it has to be approved. It means we could approve. If there are things this commission doesn't like in the concept plan because we don't think it fits that area, okay? Then the commission would have the right to say, we're not going to recommend approval to the city alderman. Okay. And so then you would make a motion saying just that we're not recommending approval. Okay, and that would go forward to the city alderpersons, and they would have the right to say, we agree or we disagree. We're going to approve it because they are the elected officials. There's his final voice. Did I do okay on that?
You did a good job.
What about conditional approvals?
What do you mean conditional approvals?
When you've in the past approved things that said it has to have a list of this, and this changed. Or against the board of aldermen.
Because they didn't meet.
That they
If-
agree that
if-
they're going to change.
If they agree to that, that's staff's job to see that those conditions are met.
Yes.
Okay, could it occur? Sure it could, but we want to make sure that it's in the concept plan.
Yes.
So the plan has to be revised to show that's included in the plan.
But if you don't like the location of this, you don't like the height of this wall or the location of this tree, and they agree to change it, it doesn't have to be rejected at that point. It can
So
be-
to answer that question, so under procedure, item 3, it says upon receipt of planning and zoning commission's recommendation, oh, this is for the board of aldermen, but I think it repeats it for planning and zoning. Yes, it does. So number 2, planning and zoning commission shall make a recommendation to the board of aldermen to approve, deny, or approve the application with conditions, and then the board of aldermen can do the same. So that would be your conditional uses.
So the answer is yes.
And there's also the ability for planning and zoning to deny for XY reason, allowing the applicant to go back and submit a new concept.
And revise it, yeah. The key here that helps you all as a zoning commission in reality is the concept plan's gotta go through the filter.
Right.
Before it ever comes here. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So it's been filtered out before it ever comes. So staff can say, yes, it meets the concept plan, those steps have all been. But that doesn't mean
Then we have to go again.
exactly, the commission can say, okay, I'm good, but I want to see some conditions here. That's this commission's right to do. Does it mean that it would necessarily go to the council at that time? Probably not. I think what we want is a clean item going through the
Right.
process.
And there's other areas within our existing code where you're able to do the same thing, where you can approve or deny with conditions. Some of the things from the Board of Aldermen, I feel that some of the things were that, because it's kind of a blanket proposal that's coming from the developer, should there be some levers, if you will, within the PUD to kind of put some more guidelines around it, so it's not just a fluid type of proposal, and there's some structure around what is allowed and what's not allowed. So some of those suggestions, I've taken the suggestions of Bruce Whitsitt, who he emailed me them post our meeting, our last Board of Aldermen meeting. And some of the things that were suggested, I've put into the attachment that Christy, or the handout that Christy gave you guys, and they're highlighted. So under development standards, so the structure of this is, it starts with the purpose, it starts with where you're able to use the PUD, and then it goes into your like basic ground rules, if you will, on if you're going to submit this, you need to follow these basic requirements, and that's the development standards, section C. So there's a few different ones. It explains that this is a floating zone, which is basically saying that, you're not, if you are currently R3, nothing within R3 is going to carry over. You're going into a new zone by going to a PUD. So that's what that's explaining. And then it explains the approval of the final PUD shall constitute a rezoning of the PUD district. It states applications for PUD concept plan and final plan shall be submitted by each applicant for PUD zoning in accordance with the provisions and conditions outlined herein. Unified control. The proposed plan development district shall be limited to the parcels that are under single control of an entity who is responsible for completing the proposed development. This provision shall not prevent a transfer of ownership or control after the development has been completed in accordance with the PUD final plan. It also states the PUD concept plan and the final plan shall be in general conformity with the spirit and intentions of this chapter. And then the PUD shall not have a substantial adverse effect on the developments of the neighboring areas. So we have that statement. What Bruce presented was the pink one, number 9, that relates to density, and that density shall not exceed the following units per acre for developments adjacent to residential zones. So that's the intent behind that is, should PUDs have like a density maximum, that we don't want, a 25-foot or 25-story building that's gonna put 100,000 people on one parcel. And so the intent behind it was to put some type of density lever. The problem with putting it in with R1, R2, R3, and then 4 units per acre, 8 units per acre, 16 units per acre, is that it's a little bit restrictive in what that could look like, because this is intended to be used for a lot of different types of development. So like R3, we know that R3 is generally multifamily, but this could be used for R3, it could be used for commercial, it could be used for a office space, it could be used for numerous things. So it's a little bit difficult to
What are we
put.
calling a unit? I'm sorry. What are we calling a unit?
The structure.
So each building?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like in 9-3, R3, we're at 16 units per acre.
Mhm.
So there couldn't be more than 16 apartments. Is that right? Where I'm going?
Apartment buildings or
No.
apartments? That's my
Apartments
question.
in a building.
Okay, that's what
Is
I
that,
was.
let me understand that. Is that where you were going with that, Bruce?
Yes, that's how it works.
The way that this is written, though, it's saying that it's adjacent to the residential zone. So again, remember, when you're going to a PUD, you are changing your
Right.
zone. So what you previously were is not relevant. So it's saying if you're moving into a PUD next to an R3, you're allowed 16 units. If you're moving in next to an R1, you're allowed 4 units per acre. So I think that there's ways that we can make sure that we don't end up with these massive buildings that are next to a single family home. And so the way that I felt like we could do that was number 7 and number 8. Limiting the height of the building, which we've done in numerous other zoning codes in our existing chapter using the same language. So there's 2 options here. Within a PUD district, no structure with residential units shall exceed 3.5 stories or 45 feet. And then we have, after that, no PUD districts adjacent to a residential zone shall exceed 3.5 stories or 45 feet. It says include. Well, no, I think it should say include. So my question to you is, do you feel that height is enough to help us balance density? And also remember though that density is not necessarily addressed in our current zoning.
My 2 cents is this, it helps. Because 45 feet is tall. And that may be too much.
That's fine.
At least my comfort, that might be too much. I would say you can have a 32-foot structure in a 3-bedroom single family. 3-story single family, okay? That's possible.
I'll be honest, I don't know what each story's height is.
Typically a story, if you figure 10 foot.
Okay,
Commercial, they figure 12, okay? But typically it's figured at 10 feet per story. So 32 feet, not unrealistic, if there's decorations, what have you.
yeah, and I didn't know if the roof line would,
That's part of that height,
yeah,
okay?
so,
And that's where I come back to. I don't know how everybody else feels, but I'm almost at 45 feet too much.
yeah, so that's how it reads in our R3 zoning chapter, or zoning code. It reads R3 has a height restriction of no more than 3.5 stories or 45 feet.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, so Carla was gracious enough to leave so that me and Bruce can now talk. We couldn't talk because we had a quorum, so we couldn't even answer any questions from him. So now we can now speak, but my intent on Monday's meeting was to have these discussions. Like heights, density, parking requirements, things like that, that maybe we do want to restrict some of that stuff. Talk about some scenarios of what could happen, what couldn't happen. How do we navigate some of that stuff? What are our feelings about that? So that we give some guidance not only to the city of what you're willing to approve and not approve, but also to a developer of, well, they're willing to look at this stuff. Because you're right, we have height restrictions in every district. Are we willing, when you create this PUD, the way this is written, it says the intent and spirit of section 50. They're not required to do anything in section 50. Right now, they can negotiate what they want. This is a starting point, but they can negotiate every one of these away if the city feels they are okay with it. I'm not saying they will, but they can. And sometimes it might be appropriate to throw some of these out for what they're doing.
Well, and again, I'll go back to the statement I made earlier. Regardless of the zone as is current, prior to getting a PUD approval, you want to build residential, you want to build commercial, you still have to comply with codes and ordinances in existence. Now, hear me out.
I'm hearing.
Just listen, don't listen to respond, listen to hear. Because there's the difference. A developer, they say he, it could be a she, a developer comes in and says, I want to propose this. Okay, so here's our filter. Can it get through this? They have to understand they're building a commercial zone. Okay. It's going to be built to the commercial standards. What exceptions, what are you looking to get in a variance of change da-da-da, and what are you gonna give for that? Be it a park deal, be it whatever, okay? What is that you're giving back to the city for this variance or for this exception? Okay? Doesn't mean they're getting approval to build it outside of the quote codes and ordinances for that particular zone. They're asking, can I do this? What's your concept? What's your plan? Let's put it down. Let's see if it goes through our filter. If it doesn't go through our filter, you're gonna have to modify it to get it through the filter first. Okay? Height restrictions, stuff like that. Is there adequate parking? You bring it up in commercial. You know, could I put a wedding venue downtown? Where am I gonna get the parking for that? Where am I supplying the parking for that? Okay? I mean, it's a great concept. But can I rely on Mary and Steve and Joanne's businesses to provide me parking so their customers can't get to their business? Seems a little unfair to me. What are you doing to provide for this? And that's part of that filter that's gotta fall through. There are certain requirements in those codes and ordinances right now that says for a business of this size, you gotta provide this. That's gonna be looked at to meet that concept plan. If it doesn't meet that concept plan by the code, how do you shake it through the filter?
Does PUD come in?
The PUD says it's a planned unit development zone, okay? It's not a construction thing, it's a zone. It says, and it's not, we're not going to go out here and throw out
Right.
this area and say, PUD's here. No. This is by request only, which means there would be a public hearing. That allow for input from the citizens. There would be the staff going through it before it ever got to that point. Okay, we've shook it through the filter. It meets the concept plan. You can now have a public hearing on it, okay? So then that would be established, and then it would come to this commission. And this commission could say, okay, it's made it through the filter. However, there's a filter up here that says, I don't like this.
And so that the filter you're referring to would be the PUD concept plan review criteria, which is on page 6. So it says that the plan represents an improvement over what could have been accomplished through strict applications of otherwise applicable base zoning district standards based on the purpose and the intent of this chapter. The PUD concept plan is in conformance with the PUD standards of the section, and the existing and proposed utility services are adequate for the proposed development. The development is consistent with and implements the planning goals and objectives of the city as contained in the city code and any other adopted policies. And then the PUD concept plan is consistent with good general planning practices, and the development will promote the general welfare of the city. But what's been added was suggested by Bruce, and then I worked with our attorneys to kind of wiggle it around just a little bit, but the PUD concept plan does not negatively affect the aesthetics, vehicular traffic pattern, and pedestrian uses of the users and uses within adjacent districts. So that's your filter.
Yeah.
In reality of, does it make an improvement, and does it negatively impact its neighbors? And so
Yeah, I
that
think Bruce,
it creates a catch-all of, if there's something there that we are not comfortable with, and we see it as a negative, it's going to fall under, does it negatively affect the
Yeah.
aesthetics, vehicular pattern traffic, pedestrian uses of the users and uses within adjacent districts?
Bruce, my neighbors, all right, I think he gave the example of a wall.
Yeah.
great example. That aesthetically doesn't fit there, but it also may be an issue for traffic. Can they see around the wall? Is it safe with that wall being there? And that's where that falls. Am I okay? So that where we're going there, Sean?
I believe so.
Was the 45 feet, was that in the past? Is that because of fire protection?
I couldn't speak to,
I'm just
Halloween.
curious, I don't know.
Typically, no, Steve. When you look at other areas, they typically look at that as aesthetics.
oh, yeah,
So we're not having,
I just wanted clarification.
yeah. This
it's
is-
really to prevent the just large buildings that don't kind of aren't cohesive with the existing buildings in Odessa that are no more than 3 stories tall.
It's probably not a good example, but the Independence Towers up there on the 24 in Susquehanna is a prime example for me. I drive along and all of a sudden here's this, I'm like, that doesn't fit here. But it would be the same thing if I wanted to go in and build a 5-story apartment building. If I got the space to do that, okay, so I want to build an apartment, that doesn't make it qualify for a PUD. What in that plan would allow it to qualify for that PUD? It's a mixed use.
In reality, if someone wanted to build over 3.5 stories in Odessa, they could not. I don't believe that it's allowed in any of our zones.
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either.
I don't think so.
But this gives the power to the city to negotiate to where they could if you gave them green space or pedestrian. That's what I'm saying,
But it's, okay.
is they could.
It could, but here's the next catch to that. It's gotta get past 2 more groups and 5,500 people.
Well, we know how that goes.
I'm just saying, they all have a voice, whether or not they choose to use it, we can't
Understand.
control that.
Understand?
But the point is, a lot of these folks sitting right here at these tables, listen to their neighbors.
Mhm.
And their neighbors say, you can't let that happen. Okay, would you please come to the meeting and say, you can't let that happen? But tell us why we can't let that happen. Well, who wants that cactus stuck in the middle of the rainforest? Probably not a good example, but it doesn't fit. So that's where I'm at. Does it fit? Just because I want to build it, doesn't mean I can. Okay, the next question is, are there sufficient utilities to support that structure? Well, probably not gonna fall through the plan because maybe it is where they want to build it at. Okay? Sorry. Can't do her there. There's not enough support. You wanna put that in for us? We'll let you,
Yeah, agree.
but
So let's spell that out.
on your dime, not ours. That's why the part's in there about it cannot adversely affect the city. We're not paying for that development.
And we've added that
Yeah,
the city shall bear no cost for infrastructure and improvements that are necessary for the development.
and that was an addition after it went to your zoning board. You guys have already approved it.
It could have been.
Yeah.
But I guess the way I look at it is between the codes and ordinances that are already in existence. It's gotta get past those too. It's not just because it's in here. It's gotta get through that. That's part of that concept plan. It's gotta get through that. So what exceptions in the codes and the ordinances existing? And this is trying to say here, well, these will work with a little bit, but you gotta have a plan and it's gotta be right.
And we do have codes that reference that we cannot pay for infrastructure for development. In reality, the thing that is allowing them to negotiate on at this point is what's listed under area regulations.
What page?
Well, this is in our actual code. So like when you go to R3, like what you're changing is the zone. You're changing from X zone to PUD zone because what's in X zone does not work for your development. So then that leaves you with what's in your original zone to be able to wiggle on. So what that leaves you with is it excludes uses permitted and uses permitted on review. And it would include the area regulations, which is the front yard, side yard, rear yard, lot width, intensity of use, which is the, like the size of the square footage of the lot itself. And then the coverage. So for example, this says main and accessory buildings shall not cover more than 35% of the lot area. And then the height requirements and the parking requirements. So those are really the only things that are out, like everything else would fall under a different area within our code. So therefore this PUD is telling them that they have to follow everything else but those things. And then instead of following those things, you need to propose a new suggestion that will then go through your filtration system.
So can we list that in this ordinance? These are the only things that you have the ability to negotiate on? Because that's not clearly stated here. And if it was, then I believe that your intent that you're explaining to me would be realized by the law. Right now, it's not. Right now, it just says everything in section 50 is on the table. But if there are parts of section 50 that are not on the table, because they could be covered on another ordinance or whatnot, we need to call that out and say, these are the only ones that you can negotiate, and these are the ones that are non-negotiable. Because that's not clear in this PUD right now. And if that's the intent of it, we need to change that.
I guess the other things that would apply would be, there's regulations on manufactured homes, signs, non-conforming buildings and structures and uses, that doesn't apply.
So we need to list that those things don't apply. And then I think your intent that you're saying becomes more real and more clear. Because I've read this 100 times and that intent did not come through in this language. And I don't believe an attorney would read it that way either. If we were to get sued because we turned someone down or approved something and a different attorney interpreted it some way different, we would have lawsuits on the city for this.
So you're saying to include where it says,
Well, you got your, when you say in development standards, this is where you talk about their starting point and the criteria. You say it's a floating zone, so you're creating, it can go anywhere in the city. Okay, that's fine. You're saying you're creating a new zone once you've established that it's going to go there. Okay, so that you aren't beholden to any other requirements in that district. It's your own zone, like an HOA type thing. Then you're saying that the PUD plan can be submitted. Okay, you're talking about process there. I think the process is pretty good to go through the approvals and let people see it. That's good. Then you're saying unified control, they can sell it when they're done. But the only real requirement you say is the PUD concept plan and PUD final plan shall be in general conformity with the spirit and intentions of this chapter. Well, the chapter in reference is chapter 50. So anything in chapter 50, as long as it's in the spirit and intention, you can negotiate it. So if there's things in chapter 50 that we're saying are non-negotiable, we need to list that. Because you're saying all of chapter 50 is on the table.
I think you're saying the opposite, that you're saying, basically, we need to say that area regulations, height regulations, and off-street parking are negotiable.
if that's what we're saying. Because right now, we're saying everything in chapter 50 can be negotiated.
I mean, but there's nothing else in chapter 50 besides signs that's applicable to building regulations.
But you just listed a bunch of them.
But that are applicable to this, to a development. The only other things that you have are,
Everything in chapter 50 is zoning. So everything, this is a new zone. So everything in chapter 50 is going to apply to a new zone.
So personally, I'm okay with them negotiating signs.
Yeah, because this, and maybe we're just thinking that this is only gonna be used for residential because they want a different
No,
setback, but
I didn't
you've got
look at it.
commercial, you've got every type of use that we allow in the city can be done in the PUD.
right,
Rightfully so, we want that opportunity, but that means everything in chapter 50 can also be, because those are requirements for every use. Signs, parking, setbacks, heights, restrictions, they're all requirements for any use. Well, that's what section 50 is.
so
Yes.
those are all, they're able to propose all of those. They are able
But
to
you
propose those.
just said that they
Some
couldn't
are
on some
not,
of them.
some are not applicable, but they're still,
But you don't, if they're not applicable, let's say it here. Say these, because you don't say parts of chapter 50 or applicable parts of chapter 50. You're saying spirit and intentions of chapter 50. That's chapter 50 as a whole. So if there are parts that are not applicable, we need to say these are not applicable to this.
So there won't be no negotiation period.
No, I think we have places we
I
want to
mean,
negotiate.
what's not applicable in my brain right now is like the definition of manufactured homes. Where areas where manufactured homes are permitted. Temporary homes, I just don't know that.
But right now, they could propose a plan to put a manufactured home. And if the city liked the plan, you could approve it, whereas our zone says you can't.
If someone came in and had a manufactured home development, we would want them to go through the PUD process. Because
Okay,
we would want to have that oversight.
Okay, but you're saying that process, that the manufactured homes don't apply right now. So,
I think the entire chapter 50 applies.
If you're proposing a PUD concept plan, be it in an R1, R2, R3, C1, C2, C3, or an industrial zone. The first thing is you have to understand is you have to comply with what's in that zone.
that's not what this says. This says you have to comply with anything in section 50. They're not saying you have to start with the R1 that's at, and you could say that. If you're proposing to change an R1 zone to a PUD, then we start with the R1 zone codes. But you don't say that. It says anything in chapter 50.
You're still gonna negotiate what your R1 codes are, like your setbacks and different things, because that's the whole deal of your PUD. You're wanting to put a denser population in a smaller place, so you're gonna have to negotiate on those things.
And they all have requirements for a reason, but you didn't tell the developer to start there. So he could come and propose, even though it's R1, he could propose industrial and start with that.
No.
According
If
to
he
this,
is
he
going
could.
to- He could,
He could.
if he is going to build an industrial type complex.
Yeah.
It would start in industrial. That's why we're trying to redo what's allowed in these zones, so that you can't just come in here and say, well,
But if
I
it's an
will do
R1,
whatever.
R2, R3, you can't put a higher zone in it anyway.
the density is
But
already.
that's not what this says.
No, that's correct. This is saying that you are moving from example, R3, 2 PUD. So everything that was in R3, it doesn't matter because you're starting fresh in a new zone. And the intent was that they would bring to us what they need because none of the current zones fit what they're trying to do, or they're trying to do something outside of the box that they are already in. So they're supposed to come to us with a
Okay.
complete brand new set of rules.
Which I think is a good tool. But like you guys are saying, they're starting here. Well, we're not giving them a filter. Our filter is all of 50. It's not starting with R1.
Right.
So are there things in here that we want to think about, like the height, that we want to say, no matter, you're starting with a clean slate, but no matter what, we don't want you to go over 45 feet.
Right.
Maybe it's because of aesthetics, maybe it's because we don't have a ladder truck calling up to put out a fire or rescue somebody. But those are the discussions that I want to start to have, and I'm willing to walk through every code if we need to and say, is there a minimum, or is this truly not applicable and we need to just leave it off the table? Because we want this tool.
Yeah.
But
That's
can't just-
exactly what you're saying.
did you see what I say now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if the goal is to set parameters for negotiations, would it maybe be helpful, instead of inventing the wheel there, to have a line in here that deviations from the requirements for the zones that exist for the primary use be justified?
That's what you are referring to, but it doesn't say they start there. That would be a very easy way to start. You're going from original zone, what are your deviations from that?
That wouldn't have anything to do with what the property was before it was PUD, but if you're putting a residential thing, but you want something, you're doing a high density residential, but it's different somehow, that you justify what it is that's different. So again, you're justifying with, low density residential, those setbacks, but it says where the
I think
expectation is still.
The intent behind it not being that way is because there's an option to use this for mixed use. So if you're going to put in something like the Branson Landing, we keep using that for an example, what base does it start with?
Correct.
What regulations do you start with? We want them to propose what they need.
And I think just saying you just have to justify
That's fair.
still gives them, they can justify it because it's mixed use.
If you're asking for, to me, I looked at the concept is, you're asking for a PUD. Okay, where is it you want to put that PUD? I'll put it right here. Okay, what do you plan to put in that PUD? Da-da-da-da-da, not gonna fit. And that comes back to.
Based on what requirements? If you tell somebody no, we haven't given them requirements in here that they can't sue us over if we tell the next guy yes.
So the problem with defining the starting point with your PUD is that PUD can include residential and business and industrial all rolled into one PUD.
Yes.
Yes.
Correct.
So how do you define which zoning rules you start with?
That is
You can't until you have that combined concept plan.
And that's where I talked about the minimum requirements of, okay, no matter what they give us, they can give us that mixed use, but we will not let them build anything over 45 feet. Anything under 45 feet, cool, give us your concept plan. Or we won't let them stack buildings closer than 5 feet to the exterior, or their exterior perimeter needs to match what the next zone is. The interior can change, but their exterior needs to at least match the zone of the setbacks. Because we talked about aesthetics. If you've got an R1 and they can only go 2.5 stories, and then all of a sudden we've allowed a 45-foot building right next to it, if aesthetics is what we're worried about, we just shot ourselves in the foot. Now, I'm not saying these are things that I recommend, but these are discussions I think we need to have and set those minimums of what we think is okay.
Within the development standards, there, item 5 and 6 give you attorney or not, our attorneys wrote this, so they wouldn't really set us up for failure in that sense. So, but
I would argue that.
number 5 and number 6, you can set, if someone's gonna put a skyscraper in the middle of Odessa, you say that generally does not conform with our zoning, period. And then you can follow that up with saying that will have a substantial adverse effect on the development of the neighboring areas.
Well, the key here for me was the PUD concept plan and PUD final plan shall be in general conformity with the spirit and intentions of this chapter and any other adopted policy, resolutions, or ordinances, which would be the building codes.
Mhm.
Okay,
That goes to the heart of what you're talking about.
correct, but here's the clause that counteracts that. The district allows variations of the zoning regulations contained within chapter 50 in exchange for open and green space, pedestrian-friendly improvements to the district. So it means, even though our current codes say they can't build a skyscraper, if they give us something we want, we can approve it. Unless we specify in here, we can't override that. Right now, we can. And my question is, are there anything we want off of the table that we cannot override no matter what they give us?
So those items that cannot be overridden, no matter what is what's listed under development standards. Which is why we added the 3.5 stories there, the no cost to infrastructure, and I did number 11, I wrote that backwards, but it should be, it has to be a minimum of 2 acres,
Shall not exceed.
yeah, I wrote it backwards.
But is that all of them? Because I have
That's
a
the
list of
question
other
that
ones.
we're trying to ask
Yeah.
the zoning board. That's where I was going with this. So I've added in the ones that Bruce selected. So from this point on, is there anything else that you feel like would be necessary?
I have suggestions if you'd like to hear them.
Sure.
First one, parking requirements. We have very specific parking requirements. I think that,
Can we let them address these 3 and then address the?
oh, yeah, if you want to address the 3 that she has listed, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't.
So number 7, 8, 10, and 11. And then we also, I don't know, I can't remember now if I explained it, but I think so.
Are we gonna include 9?
Well, 9 is the one that I don't necessarily think that the way that that's written will allow for the PUD to function with the density cap on it. I think if you guys, if you think that there are ways that we could apply density, or we can add them in, but I felt
I
like the
think
3.5
number 11,
stories.
reading no PUD district will be less than 2 acres.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's how it's
That
intended.
should go to
Is
help.
that a typo?
Yeah,
Yeah.
she wrote that backwards.
I
Yeah,
did.
that should go to help your density thing, I think.
Right.
I think that's.
Yeah, because I think I talked about that the other night at the meeting, that
Right.
I like that, because, in other words, you want to build that R3 16 unit, it's gotta be at least 2 acres. Because if it's not, how are you gonna take care of the parking? How are you gonna take care of this? Okay?
Exactly.
All you're asking for in this zone is, can I get permission to go outside of these zones or the regulations, codes, and ordinances of the city?
Correct.
When I build it. And if things like that are there, then the answer is no.
Right. And to answer the question that you asked earlier about the R1 with no more than 4 units per acre, yes, you were correct. My concern is that someone doesn't build a high rise next door, and mini homes are kind of getting to be a thing too.
Yep.
I don't want someone with an R1 home to have a bunch of mini homes that's placed right next to them also.
Totally agree. And there have been folks that have taken in certain communities, taken the Cape Cod style, shrunk them. They've done almost the same thing you're talking about. Where their side yards, you can,
Yeah.
well, we could probably shape their
Yeah.
closure, okay? And
And in some places, that might be appropriate in a downtown.
And it might be okay in a PUD, assuming the infrastructure there, the utilities, the water, the sewer, all that is large enough to support that higher density.
Or they're willing to upgrade it for us,
Or they're willing to spend their dollars to make our system better.
which is a great bargaining chip.
That
That is
it
a great
is.
bargaining chip.
It is, it's expensive and not many of them want to do that,
True.
but that's okay. Then that says, okay, you got nothing here on your table that says that's good for Odessa.
I agree with number 9. I don't think number 9, like you said, Shawna, that takes a lot of the versatility out of it. I think we need to figure out a different way to say that because, okay, so let's use the example that we know is gonna come, the 1912 building. We have a high rise that is going to be zoned different or would have different requirements. And then we know he's gonna put homes or things around it. Well, really those fit in 2 different categories, so they need a PUD to coexist on the same lot, right? So how do we blend those together?
For the density.
Well, for lots of other things, because he'll need other variances for certain things.
Well, the parking, I think we all agree with that. And
So
is the infrastructure there to support it? Utilities, okay? That's gotta go, that's part of it. It's gotta get filtered through this.
Correct.
And
I'm just trying
It
to talk
either
about
does or it
density part
doesn't.
here.
if it doesn't get through it, your plan, you gotta refine your plan, because it's not gonna filter through this.
Correct, but how do we structure something to allow a developer like that to put homes around and still be able to do those things where we're building the zone together? For the density's sake, how many is too many? How close is too close? How tall is too much?
The closeness is one of my concerns.
Yeah.
How could you allow?
Because we're creating a new zone and we're creating new variances, can we allow the justification of putting them with a sidewalk in between them? Are we willing to allow that?
I think where my opinion is right now is if you put too many regulations on it, you're taking away the flexibility of it. If you're going to put all these regulations on it, then you might as well just create a general mixed chapter. But the purpose behind this is for the flexibility.
Yep.
So they're supposed to come to us and say, I need 7 foot, I need 4 foot, I need 2 foot, I need 0, whatever it is. But if they come to us and say 0, they're gonna have to cough up some other things to be able to allow us to do that.
And if it comes to this, that may change how their building is constructed. Are they willing to bite that bullet too? You understand that?
Yeah, the one thing I want to point out though is she just admitted that if they give us the right stuff, we'll give them what they want. She said, if you want a 0 setback, you gotta really give us something worth it.
That's the
Which
whole
means it
point of a
can-
PUD.
Which means there is no minimum. And that's what I'm trying to figure out, what is the minimum that they can't, no matter what they give us, we have to say no and draw the line.
Well, there's fire codes on how far the buildings have to be set apart from each other. And we have 0 setbacks in some areas of town
We do.
already.
Well, setbacks might not be the best example, but what about height?
Well, we're putting that in
We
here,
already
Yeah.
know that.
Okay.
okay?
The other option that I think could apply to density is the coverage. So like the example that I'm just pulling from a different zone says, main and accessory buildings shall not cover more than 35%. Accessory buildings shall not cover more than 30% of the rear yard. So if we put a coverage minimum on there where your building cannot cover, or you can't vary more than, I don't know if they're different for each one, but you could put some type of coverage language on there.
Yep.
How much green
The
space
point,
per,
yeah, the point is that you have open space, so if you're going to go back on coverage, then you're taking away open space, but what that's also doing is allowing for higher density
Yep.
with higher coverage.
The 35% coverage is anything that is not green space. Driveways, patios, accessory buildings, primary structure. Because you can't, and that goes back to the water runoff. Your stormwater can't adversely affect your neighbors. And that's already in existence, not an addition, it's already there. So that doesn't, are you willing to give that up? Not me.
okay,
And that's not in the zoning chapter, though.
And it's not in the zoning chapter, it's in the building chapters, okay, the codes. Are you willing to give that up? Not me, I'm a victim of that being allowed. Doesn't make any difference, I'm not gonna fix it, I'm not gonna get it changed.
okay.
So do you guys think some coverage language should be added for density purposes?
On the density,
Mhm.
we have somebody that comes in and builds a hotel that's adjacent to a residential zone. Are they going to be subject to 16 units per acre?
Yeah, that's how that one would read, yes.
That's the issue. That's what we're trying to figure out. How do we fix that?
We don't feel like that way that's written is what is flexible enough to different scenarios, like it could be flexible to multifamily, but then if you go talk commercial, then it maybe doesn't apply as well. So is there other ways we could cap density or control density using other language?
So what I've seen, because remember, my experience with PUD goes back to when I was in college. And I reported directly on a PUD project that was very controversial in Columbia. The way they did it is you had to have, that was one of the figures that was mandated to have a report on it when it went before the concept plan. So that had to have a report on what the density was and kind of that calculation, and if there's things that went into that, such as if you've got a mixed residential, so you have one area that has really high, but other areas that have low, having that overall density and then having that specificity. And then the board was able to consider that report in the context of the neighborhood, of the surrounding, of the desired densities, which Columbia is a place generally much more open to higher densities in the first place. But to consider that, and it was a consideration that they could go for a no recommendation based off of the density calculation before them itself. So rather than it being a controlled figure going in, it could just be considered holistically, but a required report.
Which one do you get information? Bruce, what are your?
I think we need to just let them do their job now.
Great concept for me, what you're talking about is John Knox Village. They got apartment buildings, they got fourplexes, duplexes, single family, scattered all over. And they have walking trails and miniature golf and da-da-da-da-da.
Houses.
There are things for the community to do,
Mhm.
but the density is greater.
So what I dealt with was a student apartment complex. So it was kind of a
Yeah.
unique situation where each of the 3 units within one house, which would otherwise be a 3-bedroom house,
Right.
was figuring as a unit instead of the house.
Yeah, and that's what this is. is 16 units
Mhm.
and have more than 16 rooms in
Yes.
your hotel on this.
Yes.
If a hotel came, would they necessarily even do that? Would they just go to an area that it's zoned for, build their hotel and?
Right now, I say that's very true, yeah.
Okay.
With this, they wouldn't.
Yeah,
They
they're
would
gonna
have
go
to
along
learn.
the highway and they're gonna build in the most, a location where they're visible and.
Well, Owl Creek could build a hotel. They're not in the city. They can build a hotel. Their problem might be water and sewer.
Yeah.
But they could do it. And then you have that ability to have that mini homes, RV parking and what have you. That exists, but it's not in the city. You know, that's an example of something where are we willing to take that hit? What's happening here? Is there enough green space that it makes it okay? I think the concept on what are we willing to allow in coverage? I think that density ought to be there, that percentage.
What does
So-
other communities do?
That's a, that's a big question. There's so many different cities that have these, and they're all just ever so slightly different in reality. But I have seen like what Hannah's talking about, where they're requiring more of a report. But I think what I'm hearing from this, from everyone in the room, is that we don't need to necessarily restrict density, but we need to make sure that we have the ability to safely reject it if we don't feel like it's a good fit.
Yeah, that nine's just not a good fit. Concept, the density thing is, I like, but based on residential.
Agree with what Delia says. It's pretty vague. They do talk about it.
So,
Number 3,
I don't know, say,
they don't put a whole lot of detail in it, but that's what Sedelia's put in.
they refine it.
So, okay, let's see here.
Bring it back.
Would you want to have residential PUDs, industrial PUDs, or different sections, or is it just one PUD that
One,
covers
it's
it
a
all?
PUD, but it's a PUD. Again, I'll go back to what I earlier said. I want to put my PUD right here. Okay, what's your concept? What do you want to put in your PUD? What do you want? Well, I want to put, single family homes. Well, number one, that's an industrial zone and we're not going to let you.
That's if it's zoned.
It's zoned. If everything in the town has to be zoned, even if it's agriculture, it has to be zoned.
But we're throwing the zoning out once we call it PUD.
We're throwing the regulations out.
We're throwing that right. We're gonna allow change to the regulations, okay? But we still have the right to say, that's not a fit there,
Right.
okay? This won't go by, even the big bird can't carry this one by permission. They're not gonna let this egg fall, because it's not a good fit for that area of our community.
So if there was an agricultural area that somebody came in to propose, I guess they'd have to have a zoning change to build anything there.
They technically have to have a zoning change no matter what, but the question is if they're going to rezone to, like, if they're building an apartment complex, are they gonna rezone just to R3 and just follow the rules that are in R3? Or do those rules not necessarily work for the special kind of project that they're working towards, so they could use the PUD instead? But ag is gonna have to rezone no matter what if something substantial is built on it, besides ag uses. It's a little bit difficult I mean, we're trying to work towards a more structured zoning ordinance code overall.
Overall.
It's a little bit difficult to see how this can fit in because of the current code that we have.
Yep.
Because our current code is very, 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 very loose.
It's-
So
It's
it's hard to say this PUD is gonna provide flexibility when our entire code already lets anything and everything fly.
Yep.
It makes it very challenging.
Madam Chair, I'd ask that, you have them take it back and refine
Refine
it,
it.
bring it back to the commission.
I was just gonna read here the Sedalia one, so, I don't know off the top of my head if Sedalia is a floating or an
And there's
overlay.
floating too, yeah.
It is floating, okay.
And most of them are, yeah.
So under the design, are you wanting me to read the two that were circled?
No, number 3 is a specific one.
Oh, okay.
About building density.
Building spacing. Each development shall provide reasonable visual and acoustical privacy for dwelling units. Fences, insulation, walks, barriers, and landscaping shall be used as appropriate for the protection and aesthetic enhancement of the property and the privacy of its occupants, screening of objectable views and uses, and reduction of noise. High-rise buildings shall be located within a PUD in such a way as to dissipate any adverse impact on adjoining low-rise buildings and shall not invade the privacy of the occupants of such low-rise buildings. Yard setbacks, lot size, type of dwelling unit, height, frontage requirements, and use restrictions may be waived for the PUD, provided that the spirit and intent of zoning are complied with in the total development plan as determined by the commission. If topographical or other barriers within 50 foot of the perimeter of the development do not provide reasonable privacy for existing uses adjacent to the development, the commission shall impose either of the following requirements or both. And then it says structures located on the perimeter of the development must be set back in accordance with the provisions of the zoning district controlling the area.
Whatever's around it.
So, yes, structures located on the perimeter of the development must be well screened in a manner which is approved by the commission.
I like that.
Everything that's in there except high rise.
Yeah. And take note, this is Sedalia, so a little different than what we would need here.
And I
That's,
don't want to incorporate that in ours.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't think we have a need for a high rise.
So then that goes back to our just no more than 3.5 stories.
Yeah. So, I would make a motion that goes back to staff and refine it to include that, and come back to the commission.
Have a second? All in favor?
You just made a motion to,
Take the revisions and have staff bring them back at the next meeting. Which would also include that Sedalia.
Yep.
Because that doesn't go with the intent of meeting the height requirements that we already are set forth. And the density,
Well,
and not less, nothing can be less than 2 acres.
it speaks to what Bruce added too about, the no PD concept plan does, or the PD concept plan does not adversely affect the aesthetics, vehicular traffic, and pedestrian uses of the users and uses within adjacent districts.
And we're including that in 2 places. Why? So you can't miss it.
Yeah.
I would recommend finding other ones. Me and Bruce have done a lot of research. There's multiple out there, just so you can benchmark what other people have done and read them. This was Sedalia's, and it was an idea. It can be modified or thrown out, whatever you guys determine, but read what other people have done in other areas to see what we
you're
think
talking
would
to
like.
staff, aren't you?
Yeah, staff or,
Oh, I thought you were talking to them.
no, I'm not. Well, they're the ones that have to make the recommendation, right?
We already did. We made the motion and voted on it to send it back to staff to
And
clean
we-
that up.
I
If
missed
you,
something.
as an elected official, would like to submit that information to staff,
I'm
you are
reading
entitled
now.
to do that.
I'm with you now. Okay. I'm picking up what you're laying down.
We're asking for revisions.
Okay.
Yeah. This is a great time for any of our older persons that want stuff in that, to get that to you. So maybe we get this thing cleaned up, when we see it again, we can say, oh yeah, that's much better.
I can
Right.
give some recommendations to Sean of things to look at.
Right.
And I don't mind researching it too. I've done some,
Me too.
but
So moving on to the next item on the agenda. If we would like to push it to our next meeting week, we could do that. The last few, we've given ourselves a cutoff of 8:30
okay,
on our last zoning workshops.
right.
Do you think it would be appropriate to make these available?
Yeah, we can do that.
This is one I want to hear them on.
Oh, yeah.
Make copies. Chris, you can do that?
Of his, I made a couple.
Just hand them out.
Should we carry on the, do I have a motion? Do you want to, stay and work on the zoning? Or do you want to put that off till the next meeting,
Work session.
the work session?
I really don't care, don't make no difference, I ain't got that going. What do you want?
It's on the agenda, isn't it?
It is. We can move it to,
Well, it's, and
Okay.
we've kind of went longer than we normally do. That's why we're,
Typically, we want to be out here typically by 8:30. So do you want to hang around for 13 minutes, play with this, or put it off to the next week?
I think we just start fresh at the next meeting, when we hopefully have a full
Full body?
full board, and our new members will be here too for that, so.
oh, yeah.
Did we get a motion?
I would make a motion to take item 9, the work session, and postpone it to our next
I'll second.
scheduled meeting.
All in
June
favor?
19th.
Aye.
Aye. So that passes. Madam Chair,
So then there's one more.
I would make a motion to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye. I want public to make this clear. Thank you for coming.
Yes, amen,
Yeah, thank you.
thank you
Your
guys.
input means a lot to this commission,
Yes.
Thank you for serving.
because it really, really, really helps.
We're done.
You guys have a full forum now
Class
with the
dismissed.
additions? Are they full now? Are they
Oh,
still
yeah.
looking-
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Yep, because Vicky left and Margaret was there.
That's that finishing.
Okay, so you-
But they were gonna come tonight, so we had them on the agenda and then they both. had
And
to
you know what?
So,
Shannon was stuck at work.
I don't know
And
why,
that,
but there's some
is our
idea
chairperson.
that aren't on here.
I think he works like in the city.
Is that-
or
Oh,
something.
well, let me go back.
No, wait a minute, no, maybe they are. Maybe these, the group residential,
I guess I should shut this off.
Look at it.
I'll have to look at mine, so that's in here.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Because I know those three, these three right here,